So Zipporah, can you hear me?
Hello. Can you hear me
Hello?
okay?
Yeah, I can hear you
Yes.
brilliantly. Yes.
Oh, okay. Perfect.
So we're really happy to welcome you here. And let me introduce you. Zipporah Weisberg is an assistant professor of critical animal studies in the Department of Sociology at Brock University and a guest researcher at the Messerli Research Institute in Vienna, Austria. So her academic areas of specialization include critical animal studies, the critical theory of the early Frankfurt School, and existentialism and phenomenology. In March 2021, Zipporah was awarded a Culture and Animals Foundation grant for her project on animal agency in animal sanctuaries. So she has since published on a wide range of topics, including biotechnology, climate justice, and animal justice, and the psychopathology of speciesism. Zipporah is currently working on a book on reinventing humanism as a multi-species political project. So in her other life, Zipporah is an experimental dance video artist and performer. So Zipporah will give a presentation on the topic Left Humanism Beyond the Human from Marx to Merleau-Ponty. So Zipporah, as I remember, you don't have PowerPoint slides, yeah?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah,
I'm just
so
reading a
you can
paper.
start. Yeah, you can start.
Okay. Do I have to do anything for the language? Do I have to click anything uh, so that it's interpreted into Russian? You had
So
sent me something
I think
earlier. That's
I think we can figure it out later.
okay. Okay. Perfect. So yeah, I just wanted to thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real honor to be here and a pleasure. It seems like a wonderful conference, and I'm very happy to be a part of it. Yeah, and I just wanted to say that so this book that I'm working on is based on originally a dissertation chapter and then a publication on the basis of that chapter. So I'm recycling material, but it's part of a larger project that I think today more than ever is necessary to kind of redefine humanism beyond the human as a multi-species liberation project. So I hope you don't mind that I'll be reading. I just wanted to make sure I could get into the complexity, the philosophical complexity, and I felt that reading would enable me to do that a little bit better than just speaking. All right, so I'm going to try to read off my paper on the screen. If that, for some reason, doesn't work well, I will switch to the printed out copy. But without further ado, let me get started. And yes, here we go. I want to make sure I can see you as well. So just give me one moment here actually to minimize that. And please let me know if there are any audio issues or anything like that that may come up. Okay, so the title is, as Marx said, Reinventing Left Humanism Beyond the Human, from Marx to Merleau-Ponty. I'm going to read a quote from Paulo Freire, that is the epigraph of my paper. So he writes, while the problem of humanization has always been humankind's central problem, it now takes on the character of an inescapable concern. End quote. The urgency of Paulo Freire's exhortation has increased exponentially since he first penned it in 1970. In light of our ever-growing inhumanity towards other animals, the left humanist project of humanization is as urgent as ever. Animal advocates and scholars have long regarded humanism as public enemy number one. This is not surprising due to the human exceptionalist and supremacist bent of virtually all strands of humanism, whether it be Renaissance, liberal, Marxist, eco-socialist, etc. However, I want to argue today that as counterintuitive as it may seem, animal liberation could be more effective in advancing its cause than it has been to date by regarding itself as another expression of and corrective to humanism in general and left humanism in particular. Pace the anti-humanists and post-humanists, as long as the left continues to aspire towards the emancipation of human beings from tyranny, oppression, and exploitation under capitalism, imperialism, patriarchy, racism, misogyny, and other overlapping structures of domination, it is at its core a humanist project. To be sure, restoring the left humanist project without radically revising it would be disastrous for other animals. Renaissance, Enlightenment, liberal, and left humanists share the prejudicial view that humans stand over and against all other animals on the basis of arbitrary criteria, such as humans' supposedly unique possession of mind, soul, reason, and language. Marx asserted that humans alone are capable of free will and self-consciousness, or consciousness as such, and that nature is nothing but an object upon which humans act and through which they create history. Jean-Paul Sartre, Paulo Freire, Murray Bookchin, and other key figures in the left humanist tradition are no less biased against animals than Marx. Sartre's existentialist humanism reinforces Cartesian dualism, perhaps the most influential and most viciously anti-animal philosophy to have shaped modern philosophy and science, and singles humans out as the only self-transcending beings. Freire, meanwhile, maintains that, quote, animals live out their lives on an atemporal, flat, uniform prop, while humans exist in a world which they are constantly recreating and transforming, end quote. For his part, Bookchin, who introduces an ecological ethics and politics to humanism, alleges that animal rights is misanthropic, while ecological Marxist Peter Staudenmeier purports that animal rights is, quote, a specific kind of moral mistake and a symptom of political confusion that is anti-humanist and anti-ecological and frequently at odds with the project of creating a free world, end quote. Not surprisingly, critical animal studies theorist Steve Best charges left humanism in all its forms, including ecological humanisms, with being pathologically anti-animal. As far as Best is concerned, humanism will always be unable, quote, to advance a truly revolutionary break with the mindsets and institutions underpinning hierarchy, oppression, violence, species extinction, and the current global crisis, end quote. Best and other humanist and post-humanist animal studies scholars are right to condemn humanism for its human chauvinism. However, I want to argue today that it is a mistake to reject the left humanist project altogether and to dismiss it as inherently hostile to non-human animals and to the animal liberation project as a whole. Even though human exceptionalism and supremacism are central to historical humanisms, or humanism broadly understood, is not per se reducible to this prejudicial view. Left humanism in particular can be stripped of its anti-animal perspective, while its other defining features, most notably its commitment to the historical transformation of the human into a conscious, humane, self-actualized, and life-affirming subject for whom the oppression, domination, and exploitation of all animals, human and more than human, are existential impossibilities, can be mobilized to inspire the formation of a project of universal freedom for all animals, human and more than human. So my next section is titled, Reinventing Left Humanism is Not Reinventing the Wheel. Humanism has already been reinvented many times over. Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, Simone de Beauvoir, and Jean-Paul Sartre were scathingly critical of the hypocrisies of liberal humanism in particular, but rather than abandon it outright, they committed to reconceptualizing humanism as a force with which to overcome Europe's colonial and racist legacy. For example, while he lambasts liberal humanism for the violence and suffering it has inflicted on victims of its colonial tendencies and proclivities, Fanon nevertheless urges us to move towards a new humanism. Fanon, like his contemporaries, suggests that we can preserve the progressive aspects of humanist thought, such as the pursuit of universal equality, while dispensing with its more unsavory elements, such as its hyper-individualism, its integration with capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy, and its prejudicial conception of the human as white, male, and European. Fanon hopes that we will rethink what it means to be a human being in a radically new and revolutionary way. To do this, we must think creatively. He writes, let us decide not to imitate Europe. Let us combine our muscles and our brains in a new direction. Let us try to create the whole man, whom Europe has been incapable of bringing to triumphant birth. end quote. What or who the whole man is, Fanon is careful not to define or prescribe, for he does not wish to, quote, impose upon the brain rhythms which very quickly obliterate and wreck it, end quote. In short, he does not want to define for us what it means to be human per se, and so restrict the notion of human to an arbitrary set of characteristics. He does tell us the new human will not be found in a, quote, return to nature, nor in colonized peoples imitating Europeans and their civilization. Both pursuits would only amount to an obscene caricature, in his words, of the subject and object of imitation. He simply asks that everyone, particularly people of color, participate actively in the struggle for humankind's reinvention beyond the toxic categories of white and black. Why not take this a step further and reinvent the human beyond the toxic categories of human and animal, albeit without the revolutionary violence that Fanon regrettably advocates? Simone de Beauvoir also aims to reject liberal humanism while conceiving of a new humanism and a new conception of the human. For de Beauvoir, humanism can help us to rethink subjectivity and humanity outside of the subject-other dichotomy, in the sense of universal subject versus particular other, and the corresponding man-woman dichotomy. In her words, in both sexes is played out the same drama of the flesh and the spirit, of finitude and transcendence. Both are gnawed away by time and laid in wait for by death. They have the same essential need for one another, and they can gain from their liberty the same glory, end quote. Since de Beauvoir wrote these words, we have come to realize that other animals play out the same drama as human beings, a drama that centers around the need for love, acceptance, family, joy, companionship, tranquility, activity, safety, fulfillment, pleasure, etc. The task is to extend these and other rearticulations of humanism into a comprehensive interspecies or multi-species inclusive humanism. With the historical precedent for reorienting humanism towards true inclusivity and universalism, there is no reason why we cannot reinvent humanism beyond the human, beyond not just the white male human, but also beyond the human as such. This section is entitled In Defense of the Subject. Left humanism's stated commitment to defending the subject against its alienation under capitalism is particularly pertinent to the multi-species liberatory project. Recalling Marx's critique of alienation, Erich Fromm reminds us that, quote, Marx's philosophy, like much of existentialist thinking, represents a protest against man's alienation, his loss of himself and his transformation into a thing. It is a movement against the dehumanization and automization of man inherent in the development of Western industrialism, end quote. Recognizing and overcoming the alienation of human beings from their own animality and from other animals is arguably one of the most important and possibly the most challenging tasks the left faces. This is because the apparatus of animal extermination revolves around the dual or mutual alienation of humans from themselves as animals and from other animals as fellow conscious and sentient beings. Relegated to the inferior side of a huge and artificial metaphysical schism that humans have constructed to serve themselves, non-human animals are easily reducible to objects of exploitation that can be tortured and killed with impunity. Thus, we might say that the de-animalization of the human is also the ground of its dehumanization. By drawing such a thick line between human and non-human animals, humans have become distorted versions of what they could and ought to be. The defense of the coherent subject against its reification under capitalism is the primary goal of Marxist, socialist, and existentialist humanisms. Whereas in a bewildering move, anti-humanists aim to get rid of the subject itself, quoting Foucault, Elizabeth Butterfield observes that, in her words, there is a sense that the postmodern deconstruction of the human now requires a reconstructive moment, end quote. She rightly maintains that left humanism is an excellent starting point for this reconstruction. This is not least because left humanism adamantly insists on the importance of restoring the subject to coherence, unity, and wholeness against its usurpation by the technological and capitalist apparatus. Fromm observes that humanism has from threatening forces, from religious fanaticism in the Renaissance to slavery and nationalism in the Enlightenment, and radical alienation resulting from rationalization, industrialization, and mechanization in late modernity. By 1965, when Fromm joined other socialist humanists, such as Raya Dunayevskaya and Ernst Bloch, in calling for a revitalization of the socialist humanist project, the primary fear was that human beings would also, quote, become the slaves of things, end quote. In short, the greatest menace in late modernity was the world capitalist system and the possibility of total, irreversible reification and alienation it introduced. And this remains arguably one of its greatest threats today. Fromm and other socialist humanists argue that the subject can defend itself against its potential annihilation through recourse to its capacity for self-creation, self-transformation, and self-development. The celebration of this capacity is central to all forms of humanism, in fact. Italian Renaissance humanist Pico della Mirandola, for example, insisted that, in contrast to both human and animals, higher spirits or angels who were pre-programmed. I'm sorry, I'll read that again. Pico della Mirandola insisted that in contrast to both non-human animals and higher spirits or angels who were, in his view, pre-programmed, the human being was an indeterminate form. Of course, Pico is privileging the human at the expense of all other beings here, including angels even. But there is no reason that human indeterminacy cannot be disentangled from Pico's prejudicial views. Enlightenment humanists also celebrate human self-overcoming, but purge it of its religious or theological content and instead locate humans' capacity for self-transformation and transcendence in the powers of reason. Jean-Jacques Rousseau stood out among Enlightenment philosophers for his emphasis on the historical nature of self-transformation and transcendence. Marxist, socialist, and existentialist humanists build on the traditional humanist commitment to self-transcendence and transformation, but frame it even more overtly within the context of the larger political, social, and historical struggle. According to Sartre, quote, "Man is nothing else but that which he makes of himself. Man is, indeed, a project which possesses a subjective life, instead of being a kind of moss or a fungus or a cauliflower," end quote. Or what we might add, a series of nodal points in a network of circuits, as Jean-François Lyotard once put it. For Paulo Freire, socialist humanism is also about the completion of the as yet incomplete human being. Frantz Fanon contends that decolonization in particular would usher in a new humanity. Those are his words. However it is framed, the socialist and existentialist humanist call for the self-creation, transcendence, transformation, etc. of the subject is important for any emancipatory project because it reinforces the subject's autonomy over and against the techno-capitalist apparatus. The principle of self-creation depends upon a unified, coherent, and autonomous subject who objectifies its own life as a project. Without a coherent subject, this kind of self-transcendence or self-transcendence in any form is actually impossible, in my view. And without self-transcendence, historical transformation is impossible. Although traditional notions of self-creation involve the overcoming of animality, as in Pico's work especially, a revised notion of self-creation would involve its restoration to its animality. A new humanism beyond the human requires the self-creation of the human not as an animal that transcends itself and its immanence, and therefore its animality and other animals, through reason, free will, and universality, but rather requires the self-creation of the human as an embodied being that develops itself in its immanence, that is, in its erotic and sensuous engagement with other beings in the world. Only by way of embracing human animality can humans achieve the humanization that has so far eluded us. Only by way of becoming animals can humans become complete human beings. In the words of John Sanbonmatsu, quote, true overcoming of nihilism entails not denial of the animal, but the reverse, a reconceptualization of ourselves as a subject for whom subjectivity is always already intersubjectivity, Mitsein, being with other beings in the world, end quote. Seen this way, the self-creation, transcendence, and transformation of the human is newly associated with the self-realization and self-discovery of the human as an animal among other animals. The fulfillment of species being or human essence as a rational, free-willing, self-conscious, and self-objectifying being becomes the fulfillment of interspecies being as a thinking, feeling, free-willing, self-conscious, self-objectifying being in the world. For Marx, human self-reconciliation as a natural being and the objectification of its senses as sensuality are integral to its overcoming its self-alienation. But while the human could transcend the instinctual act of feeding to the loftier act of eating, in Marx's view, the animal could not. We reject this claim and redefine human reconciliation as reconciliation, we define human reconciliation as the erasure of this false binary between what the human is capable of and what the animal is restricted to. In the new humanist framework, neither the human nor the animal is reduced to instinct, but is understood as being always already fueled by desire and intentionality. Thus, we create the conditions in which prevent any sentient being, human or non-human, from being reduced to a mere animal or an object of exploitation. An argument can also be made for animals' capacity to self-create. Animals too self-develop and self-transcend, inasmuch as they strive daily and throughout their lives to fulfill their entelechy and to live in the fullness of their being. Although other animals may not be self-conscious or self-objectifying in the same way that humans are, this is by no means a deficit and by no means suggests that they're not self-conscious and self-objectifying in another way, perhaps a way that we have yet to understand. And if they don't if they aren't self-conscious or don't self-objectify in the same way human beings do, this may in fact be a boon, insofar as their experiences are apparently unencumbered by the proverbial baggage of language and ideology. They may not see themselves as part of a species per se, and therefore may not universalize their own experience per se, as Marx understood it. But this is immaterial. What is important for the purposes of the project of humanization and reconciliation is that each individual animal is given the opportunity to self-actualize and self-create in a way that is most fitting to them. For humans, on the other hand, meaningful self-creation within an inter and multi-species humanist framework involves the development of our latent and repressed empathic tendencies into an active force for historical transformation. Humans' apparently unique capacity to universalize should be the very thing that enables us to empathically identify with, rather than detach ourselves from, our sense of community and kinship with and responsibility for other animals. As Melanie Joy explains, we ought to establish, quote, an inclusive humanist paradigm wherein empathy and unconditional nonviolence are considered central to human psychological wellness, end quote. Human self-overcoming, in other words, is inextricably linked to our psychological well-being, which in turn depends upon the active cultivation of empathic solidarity with other animals. Importantly, a specifically left humanist conception of self-creation is acutely aware of the unified subject's vulnerability to and embeddedness in historical and socioeconomic realities. According to Fromm, whereas Renaissance and Enlightenment humanisms assumed that education would help the human achieve its goal of self-perfectibility, in his words, the socialist humanism of Karl Marx was the first to declare that theory cannot be separated from practice, knowledge from action, spiritual aims from the social system, end quote. And that, in other words, the self-perfectibility of the human being depended on the transformation of social and economic conditions. This distinction allows for a small proverbial window of opportunity for self-overcoming that is not permitted by a theory that denies the possibility of refusal. For Herbert Marcuse, the transformation of the subject and the transformation of society are part and parcel of the same process. The qualitative change in the needs and the infrastructure of the subject involve distancing the human from the technical apparatus in which it is currently entangled. Far from leading us further down the path of human glorification, left humanism humbles the human subject and restores it to its animality and thereby to its empathic identification with other animals. And just to clarify, for Marcuse, the dialectical relationship with socioeconomic conditions is an important one to maintain, and this is something that it seems that Foucauldian thinkers and posthumanists and anti-humanists tend to deny or reject. And without this dialectical tension, there is no possibility for transformation or for the eradication, if you will, the dissolution of the technical apparatus, the techno-capitalist apparatus, and also the animal exterminationist apparatus. So this dialectical tension is essential to a left humanist program. Moving now to universal freedom. The specifically political dimension of the defense of the subject lies in the struggle for universal freedom. Marcuse explains that the human subject's recognition of itself as an animal is integral to its individual and historical freedom. Human freedom is inextricably bound up with the freedom of the senses from their co-optation and depletion by technique. In his words, human freedom is rooted in the human sensibility. The emancipation of the senses would make freedom what it is not yet, a sensuous need, an object of the life instincts, eros, end quote. The re-eroticization and re-animalization of the subject, then, is not only an ethical move, but also a fundamentally political one. The freedom of the human being also involves the transformation of itself from a sovereign being to a sensitive being, in all senses of that word. Marcuse explains further, quote, "The faculty of being receptive, passive, is a precondition of freedom. It is the ability to see things in their own right, to experience the joy enclosed in them, the erotic energy of nature, an energy which is there to be liberated. Nature, too, awaits the revolution, exclamation point, end quote." Sanbon Matsu's metahumanism is also at its core, quote, "a defense of the freedom of the subject," end quote, both human and more than human. Freedom is only truly universal, Sanbon Matsu rightly insists, if it involves the freedom of other animals, freedom from violence, and freedom to fulfill their entelechy. Thus, the self-transcendence of the human being depends upon allowing other animals and creating the conditions for other animals to be involved in their own projects of self-transformation, whatever they might be, and however different they might be from our own. In short, the fulfillment of the freedom of the individual subject is never at the expense of the fulfillment, so I should say the fulfillment and freedom of the individual subject is never at the expense of the fulfillment and freedom of the animal other, but rather always depends on supporting the other's self-development and fulfillment, as I said above. The mutually reinforcing freedom of the human and animal subject can also be understood in terms of Sartre's conception of the particular and the universal subject. For Sartre, existentialism is a humanism precisely because it insists that, quote, "in choosing for himself, man chooses for all men," end quote. That the responsibility of the individual, quote, "concerns mankind as a whole," end quote. And that the subject is an in an intersubjective world in which, quote, the intimate discovery of myself is at the same time the revelation of the other as a freedom which confronts mine, end quote. As Butterfield notes, the call for the reconciliation of the universal and the particular is among Sartre's most important contributions to the philosophico-political project. For Sartre, who replaces the term individual with singular universal, in his words, the person is universal as an incarnation of a greater social context, but the person is also singular in his or her own particularity and differential, end quote. And I apologize, those are Butterfield's words, paraphrasing or explaining Sartre. Existential freedom is truly universal because, paradoxically, it requires the subject to balance its own claim to freedom with the same claim of every other particular subject or singular universal in Sartre's terms. Sartre's characterization of freedom echoes ethical phenomenologist Emmanuel Levinas's view. For Levinas, good freedom is always already responsible freedom, a freedom, in fact, tempered by shame. Quote, and these are Levinas's words, shame is where freedom discovers itself murderous in its very exercise, end quote. Ethical freedom for Levinas lies in the renunciation of the power to kill. He continues, the other, whose exceptional presence is inscribed in the ethical impossibility of killing him, in which I stand, marks the end of powers, end quote. In Fanon's vision, the particular subject's freedom translates into universal love, or the ability to, he says, love man wherever he may be, end quote. Of course, for Sartre, Levinas, and Fanon, the human species is the limit of this universal freedom and love. But to actualize a truly universal freedom would require that other animals are at once deemed, regarded, and recognized as particular and universal. Other animals are particular in their uniqueness one from the other. But they are always already universal, not only in their ethical, but also in their political and historical co-relationality with each other and with human beings. Although animals are not responsible for humans, one central component of humans' universality is our responsibility for other animals. There is not only, quote, a human universality of condition, as Sartre suggests, but an animal universality of conditioned, defined from the Levinasian vantage point by vulnerability, fragility, and mortality. Because the human subject is uniquely capable of preventing the same suffering it is uniquely capable of inflicting, it is uniquely compelled to act on behalf of another's well-being, whether that other is human or non-human. And this responsibility, this form of universality, if you will, applies specifically and only to human beings. With this reevaluation of alienation and the new conception of the animal-human co-subjectivities and historical transformation in place, a new multi-species humanism can begin to take shape. This next section is called Dialectics and the Conquest of Nihilism. The humanist subject is a historical subject, and the historical subject is a dialectical subject that refuses to accede to and participate in the economy of violence. The tool it mobilizes to this end is dialectical rationality, which I mentioned briefly above. Dialectical rationality enables the subject to position itself at a critical distance from the prevailing order, to identify its betrayal of the concepts and principles it touts, the it here being the prevailing order. For example, in the tensions between the freedom it promises and the unfreedom it offers, and to imagine alternative approaches to social, political, ethical, and aesthetic organization. Building on the value of critique that is so central to Enlightenment humanism, proponents of dialectical reason suggest that reason is nothing if not negative. For Marcuse, quote, the instinctual rebellion will have become a political force only when it is accompanied and guided by the rebellion of reason. The absolute refusal of the intellect and the intelligentsia to lend their support to the establishment, and the mobilization of the power of theoretical and practical reason for the work of change, end quote. Without the rebellion of reason and the concomitant assertion of an outside, the subject would be powerless to resist its colonization by the prevailing and highly irrational ideology. It would not recognize irrationality for what it is, but would rather confuse irrationality with rationality and support the very system that depends on its voluntary acquiescence. And this is what is taking place now. A negative standpoint, on the other hand, cultivates the spirit of resistance and, crucially, enables the subject to think in universal and world historical terms. Without the rebellion of reason, the subject would be ill-equipped to commit to historical transformation, but would remain atomized and self-absorbed, and as such, continue to serve the system which depends upon its estrangement from and indifference to its fellow subjects, human and non-human. Thus, while the self-creation or self-transcendence of the subject, as we discussed above, do not occur somehow outside of the existing social and economic conditions, they do allow for and even demand a refusal and rupture of existing conditions. Left humanism calls for what Marcuse refers to in Nietzschean terms as, quote, a political practice of methodical disengagement from the establishment, aiming at a radical transvaluation of values, end quote. The practice of refusal involves, again, Marcuse's words, involves a break with the familiar routine ways of seeing, hearing, feeling, understanding things so that the organism may be receptive to the potential forms of a non-aggressive, non-exploitative world, end quote. Refusal, in other words, constitutes a deliberate break with the dominant ideology and a deliberate and necessary reconstitution of the subject in opposition to it at the instinctual or biological level, to use Marcuse's terminology. For Fanon, disalienation involves a break not only with the past, but also with the present. He writes, the body of history does not determine a single one of my actions. I am my own foundation. For example, while the Negro, to use the terminology of the time, is a product of history, it also blasts out of this mold and rejects its creation by others as an object of oppression by recreating itself now at the present historical juncture as a human being. On one hand, while the human is bound to the contingencies of its factical existence in the world, including a given social, cultural, ethical, political, and economic order, those conditions themselves can change in part as a result of the subject's deliberate refusal to submit to them. Although existentialism is charged with a kind of pessimism and with being, as people say, an invitation to people to dwell in the quietism of despair, this is Sartre quoting people, it is eminently hopeful because it, Sartre continues, confronts man with the possibility of choice, and therefore the possibility of determining its own trajectory with limitations. For our purposes, this means that the subject that has internalized the animal exterminationist worldview can choose to reject that worldview and reshape itself according to a different set of, say, anti-exterminationist values. Georg Lukács noted that, from a Hegelian Marxian perspective, dialectics is central to the self-transcendence of the subject, both as an individual and as a historical force. For both Hegel and Marx, the self-creation of the subject depends on the dialectical method, which is the only method that casts the subject's self-alienation and objectification into relief. The method is not only epistemological, but also defines the movement of history itself. A dialectical analysis would not remain satisfied with simply identifying the conflict, but would insist on bringing it to resolution by bridging the gap between how freedom is currently defined as a human concern, and necessarily so, and how it could be and should be defined as a fundamental concern for all animals, human and more than human. Marcuse and Bookchin both suggest that Platonic dialectics provides an especially powerful antidote to technological rationality inasmuch as it refuses to take appearances for granted, but is instead always restless and agitated, always striving to explore the tension between the way a thing or an idea is in the world and the way it could or ought to be. The recognition of the difference between the way things are and the way they ought to be is an important inspirational or an important source of inspiration, we should say, for any radical political project, especially one which seeks to overcome the systemic extermination of animals. The dialectical conception of the subject and the dialectical method more generally enables its practitioners to develop a philosophy and a practice of hope against the current tide of nihilism, which is characterized by anti-humanists and post-humanists' seemingly unreflective attraction to the fragmentation and hybridization of the subject and their indifference to the structural violence against animals. Now, this is not all post-humanists, but I would say post-humanism as a whole tends in this direction. A potent theory and practice of resistance would involve a refusal of the existing order and of all of its abuses against all animal subjects, a refusal that is shaped by the recognition that the way things are is not the way they should be, that the torture and murder of tens of billions of non-human animals for profit and superficial human gratification is an abomination, and in every way contrary to what a healthy society consists of. With this opposition laid out, the task becomes once again clear: to create the conditions for human and non-human animals to fully realize themselves, to flourish mutually, and not at each other's expense. The resolution of this epistemological tension corresponds to the resolution of the ontological tension between a being's actuality and its potentiality. This reconciliation, according to Marcuse, is, quote, the work of logos and eros, end quote. It reconciles in peaceful harmony not only the object and its concept, but the being and what it is in essence, which is to say, what it ought to be. Essence not in a fixed, unchanging sense, but precisely in the sense of a teleological platform, if you will, for someone to develop into who they are and who they are meant to be, with intention, with consciousness, not as a matter of fate or something to which one is subject, but that is part of the self-objectifying process of self-creation and self-fulfillment. In seeking to create the conditions for epistemological reconciliation, in other words, critique, dialectical reasoning, helps pave the way for the subject's ontological reconciliation, which, in Marcuse's view, is constituted by, quote, the joy of being, end quote. As stubbornly as naysayers might try to deny it, the joy of human being is intimately tied up with the joy of non-human animal being. In conclusion, I will close with a few brief comments about Merleau-Ponty's contribution to our discussion of a humanism beyond the human. Without entering into the complexities of his analysis of humanism in Humanism and Terror, in which he critically analyzes Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon, we can appreciate Merleau-Ponty's honest reflections of the moral quagmire of politics in general. Whatever Merleau-Ponty's position on violence might be, and it is controversial, he is correct to suggest that the logic of politics as we know it, whether it's liberal humanist or Marxist humanist, is unfortunately a logic of violence, or is interpreted as a logic of violence. Even if Merleau-Ponty is right, there is nothing to stop us from reimagining humanist politics in a different light, as inherently nonviolent, or according to a logic of nonviolence. Our humanism, as we have established, is of a different order. It does not rest on destruction as a means to creation. The new human we are seeking does not emerge from the ashes of civilization because it was there to the founding of civilization. Right, sorry, I misread my own sentence here. The new human we are seeking does not emerge from the ashes of civilization because the new human was always already there at the founding of civilization and is always already there in every moment. The new man is an old man. The new woman is an old woman. The new human is an old human. She has always been there. She is there in our body soul, as our body soul, when we reach out to caress our beloved cat and dog companions, when we stop and gaze in admiration at birds swooping in the sky, when we recoil at animal cruelty, when we kiss a pig, when we caress a cow, when we rejoice at animals' joy. A seismic shift need not spell the ruination of what is, in other words, but can allow what ought to be to merge with and gently subsume what is in a dialectical manner. To begin this process, we must think and act in good faith. We must take an honest look at ourselves and admit to our own hypocrisies and failures. For, in Merleau-Ponty's words, quote, a regime which acknowledges its violence might have in it more genuine humanity. So let's at least start there. We cannot call ourselves genuinely human in the sense of humane until we admit to our everyday inhumanity. He continues, to understand and judge a society, one has to penetrate its basic structure to the human bond upon which it is built. This undoubtedly depends upon legal relations, but also upon forms of labor, ways of loving, living, and dying, end quote. We must also examine, following from this, the human-animal bonds, or we could say animal bondage, upon which society is built, the forms of labor, ways of loving, living, and dying to which we subject or which we deny other animals. We work them to death. We love them to death. We bring them into life only to bring about their deaths. How can we radically reconceptualize our relationship with other animals as one not of bondage, but of mutually reinforcing bonds? By redefining the human along Merleau-Pontian phenomenological lines, as an embodied being among other embodied beings, as an embodied or body consciousness among other body consciousnesses, all of whom are perpetually engaged in co-constitutive world-making. Merleau-Ponty's contribution to the humanist project is to provide a conceptual framework for this reimagining. Through the phenomenological lens of Merleau-Ponty, man is not alone on his island anymore. The human is reborn as the animal she was and has always been. The human being is always already in intersubjective relation with others, is always already co-constituting worlds with and perceptually attuned to other beings and entities with whom and with which she shares the earth. With her coming into being as a revitalized and reanimalized subject, other animals alongside the human animal can also finally come into their own being as revitalized and reanimalized subjects without human-imposed impediment and violence. This may be an idealized view of the new multi-species humanist future, but it is not unachievable, and it is necessary for our survival as much as for other animals. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this insightful speech, Zipporah. I hope you want to have a little discussion, but before we start the discussion, can you please enable the English channel to
Oh,
understand
okay,
the
that's now,
question?
yes. So what do? I go to
So there
Russian?
are no English. There are three dots on the right hand.
Yeah, so I see here, so it says listen in original audio, English or Russian?
English. You
Yeah,
can
okay, it's
open
on
English.
that already. Yeah. Is that working? Because
So
I
that's it.
have it.
Dima, Leah, does it work?
Yeah, okay.
So, dear
First time
colleagues,
doing
are there any questions for Zipporah? You can ask them in Russian, and our translators can translate them for Zipporah. Or you can write them in the chat.
Good morning. I'll go
Oh,
ahead and start first, if that's okay. Wonderful.
Yes,
hi, Vasily.
yeah, it's okay.
Great to see you.
So I love your talk, and here's my main question.
Sure.
What is the benefit from retrieving any aspect of humanism? So I'll explain a little bit. So I completely
Yeah.
agree that we can rethink the definition of the human as embodied beings, 100%, absolutely. I completely agree it's retrievable. I completely agree that it could be merged with an animal liberation basis.
Mhm.
What I am still unclear of is what do the animals get out of that?
Right. Okay, no, and so on the one hand, I want to say, well, that was what my talk was trying to say.
Right,
But
I
I'm glad you
understand.
ask it because no, and this is something I need to think about in the framing of the book in general, because I say that at the beginning and then I sort of conclude with that, although in this case, actually, the conclusion is more specific and focuses on embodiment and on violence, etc. But then maybe the humanist framework itself as a framework gets lost. So thank you for pointing that out, that maybe there's a need for a much greater elucidation. Because yeah, I've had to ask myself why. So I have a two-part answer. The first is this is a response to post-humanism and anti-humanism. Of course, I take the easy route as a scholar and I complain about what other people have done rather than coming up with my own innovative ideas. So as you know, in the past, I've been very critical of especially certain expressions of post-humanism, a la Donna Haraway, Rosie Braidotti, etc. Right? This celebration of hybridity, of cyborgs, because of the fact that it's actually happening in laboratories today and has horrible consequences specifically for non-human animals, but also for humans, and is tied up with the capitalist system. So, and the system of commodification, etc. So I wanted to kind of, as a critical animal studies thinker, I wanted to and still want to create a bit of a tension, a dialectical tension between the traditions that I'm calling upon and the traditions that a lot of critical animal studies scholars are calling upon, which really stem more from the Foucauldian track. And I feel that the Frankfurt School as such and these early existentialist humanists have been lost. Their work, I think, is more relevant today than ever. And I kind of feel like we're overdoing it with our attempt to find new and wild ideas that sort of fit with the contemporary ethos. The contemporary ethos isn't so great. Not that it was great at the time either, right? Of course. But I feel that these thinkers have a language that they captured really important concepts. They captured phenomena, social, political, ethical, etc., that were taking place, and they spoke in a language. They developed and drew upon a discourse that offers something very specific to the challenges we're facing today, or offers something to us in our attempt to address and somehow overcome or meet the challenges that we face today. This is a language that's been lost. It's a whole tradition that's been lost. And that still doesn't answer the humanist question, other than the fact that they all, I say, self-identify as humanists to larger and lesser extents, right? So it's perhaps more of an issue of sort of identity, if you will, although it's very non-identity politics related, but it's a question of positioning. right? It's a question of intellectual and political positioning. Now, so that's the first part of the answer. The other part is that I do believe that humanism, specifically humanism, is not only it's not that, because I know that, for example, Kerry Wolf has, he's the one really that I think was the first to talk about post-humanism, right? So he did say we're sort of sublating humanism, we're going beyond, but I have a bit of an allergy to the post term because I feel that it's a bit too triumphalist, like, oh, we're past that, first of all. Also, it's just overused to the point of kind of meaninglessness. Like we're post everything. And I don't know if that's true. And I think it has a kind of, it's fetishized. Post this and post that is a kind of fetishized concept. So humanism, I think we shouldn't be ashamed because of the word human to go back to humanism, because first of all, humanism is not a homogenous movement, ideology, program. As I didn't emphasize it so much in this iteration, I had to cut a lot to get in. That's, of course, the easy excuse. But I have talked about the fact that humanism tends to be reduced to a homogenous, it's basically reduced to human exceptionalism and human supremacism, period, with absolutely zero attention paid to the historical nuances. And different humanisms they have very interesting differences among them and between them. And these tensions are very fruitful. And I feel that what specifically humanism actually has to offer is that it's focusing on understanding human beings. And this to me, and understanding, and then of course I drew on self-creating, if you will, self-transcending the human as it has typically been understood. And what that means and what typical means changes over time, right? Pico's human is very different from Sartre's. But there's an element that this is what's lost. And this is why humanism, because in all of those humanisms, yes, human exceptionalism, supremacism, horrible, and we need to address that full on, be honest about it. And perhaps that's so limiting that we're going to have to reject humanism altogether. I don't believe so, but perhaps I would be open to someone proving that to me. But I think that that's actually not really, at the end of the day, what's most important. What humanism offers is exactly what we need in this day and age, which is a dialectical tension. First of all, an attention on the human subject, which has been reified, which has been folded into the techno-capitalist, digital, virtual apparatus. And I feel that we are fetishizing the post-human, we're fetishizing the techno-human in a way that has actually forgotten and has allowed for the increasing fragmentation, if you will, of the human. So the emphasis on the human, because we have failed. I think it was Elisa El Tolo who said this, that the human project has failed. Why? Because we are leading ourselves to suicidal destruction and we're taking everybody down with us, literally, right? So we need to redefine what the human being is. And that's why it has to be a humanist project in that sense, because the whole problem that we're facing is one of misunderstanding human life. And I think that's actually universal beyond European Western civilization. I think that there's a universalism that is properly universal there. And because of, I don't know that there's any other, so this is another, I hope, sort of answer to your question. I just don't know that any other philosophical language or philosophical movement, it's hard to sort of even define humanism according to one or the other category, right? Or place it in a category because it's so many things. I don't know that there's another one that has a kind of cohesion historically, but then also has all of those differences that are important and necessary for productive thinking and critical thinking especially, and reinterpretation. I don't think that I haven't come across another one, if you will, that has provided me with the guidance that I think that we need as a guiding framework that we need to not only reinvent the human, but in a way reinvent the multi-species liberation project. Because we're still so fragmented into these different groups, and there are these efforts, but they tend to then move towards liberal approaches, which aren't necessarily bad. There's a lot to be said for a lot of redeeming features about sort of liberal political approaches, but the repoliticization of the question, or the political turn in animal studies, I think needs to be, or can at least be much more informed by these political humanisms that go way beyond liberal humanism than they have been to date. So that's a bit of a rambly answer, and I don't know if it really gets to what you were asking, but that's the best I can do. Thanks for your question, Vasily.
Yes, thank you for the question, and we're happy to hear you today, Vasily. Again, so I guess I see another question. I think Laura wants to ask.
Yes, thank you. So first of all, Zipporah, thank you so much. Amazing talk, and I'm a huge fan of your work. I was so excited when I saw that you were going to be speaking at this conference.
Thank you.
I was really interested in when you talked about social ecology and its sort of, strange relationship with animal liberation, because on the one hand, it doesn't have the limitations of other strains of humanist ideology, right? It does take a more ecological perspective, both in the sense of, looking at the interrelationship, ecological issues, but also specifically looking at the interrelationship between domination, oppression, inequality, and justice within human society, and how that impacts both humans and then also nature. So it's like this, huge kind of like lapse of logic, in my opinion, to omit how those systems of hierarchy and domination within human society impact individual non-human animals.
Yes.
So I'm really curious to hear, because I'm actually very involved with social ecology, and I have noticed that even Peter Staudenmeier, who wrote that, anti-animal rights manifesto, really seems to be kind of opening his mind to integrating these ideas. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how animal liberationists with a more expansive perspective that does take into consideration human liberation and ecological issues, how can we converse with social ecologists to integrate these ideas?
Very good question. Thank you. And I wish I had the silver bullet answer, because it is sort of the $60 million question, right? In a ways, how do we bridge that gap? And at the risk of repeating myself, I do feel like actually maybe this speaks back to Vasily's question, that if we use this framework of humanism beyond the human very explicitly, actually that creates a common ground, right? Because when it's not so much sort of starting from the animal and starting from the ecological, or even starting from the human. It's starting from a set of premises or an infrastructure or a scaffolding, however you want to look at it, that then creates a kind of common language and a common set of aspirations. I think it's one thing to say, listen, Bookchin, Staudenmeier, you're wrong to suggest that, well, in Bookchin's case, to suggest that animal exploitation is somehow compatible with the socialist ecology, right, or eco-socialism or eco-humanism, and for him to say, well, just to write that off. I mean, I think it's in a way arguing with someone who is refusing to recognize the fallacy of their own argument, simply put. Because if we follow, especially his sort of the anarchistic tendencies, which I don't talk about as much in this version of the paper, in the longer chapter, I do talk about that, the anti-hierarchy and so on and so forth, right? The rejection of hierarchy, that's very explicitly applicable to the human hierarchy, so arbitrary, right? The power that we wield and claim over other animals. So if we're really truly committed to a non-hierarchical model, whatever, then we need to include other animals, period. And then Staudenmeier's idea. So that's interesting to learn, and it has been a while. I need to really revisit the literature and sort of update a little bit on what's happening with the in the contemporary social ecology movement as a movement as well, beyond just the scholarship. So that's something that's kind of on my list of necessary things to do when I develop that as a chapter. But yeah, I think it's interesting that you say that, because my guess is that he's recognizing that it's not a moral mistake, that it's not anti-humanist, that he was reacting out of this typical sense of being threatened, right? This kind of, and I think he was, there's a failure in the imagination among most environmentalists, most social justice activists, frankly, that don't include other animals in their thinking or in the sphere of concern, that somehow there are humans and then the earth. And then there's this whole abyss of the billions of other species and individuals that form those species, if we want to use that language, but maybe better not, but other individual animals and beings that are excluded unless they're the ones that belong to nature. And that's just, I think, a failure. That's a reproduction of the arbitrary categorization of animals into domesticated and wild. Also, and this is something I've talked about, it's part of the exterminationist paradigm, whereby we are terrified at extinction, right? And we also, of course, glorify charismatic megafauna just because of their beauty. It serves us. So it's part of the self-serving thing. It's kind of aesthetic instrumentalization. But then with domesticated animals, which are the ones that are most brutally abused, as we know, they're infinitely reproducible in the capitalist commodity chain. So one pig, like killing one pig, doesn't mean anything to an ecologist as such, because they're not concerned with that animal as an individual. They're concerned with the impact on, the environment, so fossil fuels and Amazon, burning the Amazon down, et cetera, and waste, and all of those things are important. But I think that's a reflection simply of an internalization of the exterminationist model. So I don't take that position seriously. For me, it's there's no philosophical justification for ignoring animals, especially if you're ecologically and social justicely, if you will, minded. But the fact that it's opening, that Staudenmeier, as you suggest, is opening up, also is showing that as much as we're feeling as though we failed as animal liberationists, I wouldn't say that. I actually don't agree with that. A lot of people say that, but I think we're too self-critical in that sense, or too self-flagellating. This is my whip. I think that it's a failure of the imagination on the part of others, but that has shifted because of vegan and animal liberation activism. That now people are starting to recognize it's not an us or them, it's an us and them. And the longer we deny it, the further, the closer we get to the apocalypse. That's why I've done sort of psychopathological analyses, because I'm also interested both socially and individually. I'm interested in the mechanisms at play that allow for this profound denial, that is so transparently a denial, which comes down to what you want to have for breakfast and the power and entitlement. Nobody wants to give up privilege. Privileged beings don't want to, and subjects or members of society, whatever, groups don't want to give up their privilege. But we're at a moment now that the urgency is such that, especially people who are devoted to thinking through concepts and thinking about solutions, possible solutions, I think have to face that reality. So it's not so much the burden of animal liberationists anymore, as we tend to say. It's the burden of others to finally wake up. So I'm glad that it's starting to happen.
Yes, thank you very much for your question, Laura, and thank you very much for your answer, Zipporah. So Dima and Leah, can you hear me? I know that our time for interpretation is over then. So we can continue discussion without you. Thank you very much for interpretation. So yeah, we have another question, I guess. Katja, do you want to ask?
Yes, thank you. Hi, Zipporah. Thank you for
Hi.
a wonderful talk. I
Thank
totally
you.
support everything you say and share your passion for disseminating these ideas. However, and I also know that Lisa Altola is interested in this. There's always a question of translating these ideas into practice.
Yeah.
And when it comes to that, it seems like the integrated world, capitalism, and all the cognitive psychopathologies it brings along are unstoppable. And Professor Sampamatsu yesterday was quite pessimistic about our future and said that he doesn't see the way out of it. So
Yeah.
if you have
Yeah.
thought about that, and what are the most effective ways, in your opinion, to bring more just multi-species future closer? And what would you recommend to start with in the field, especially in the view that the question of climate change and mass extinction is quite pressing?
Yes, indeed, indeed. Thank you for the question. So it's funny because I'm really starting to embrace strategic pluralism much more than I would have perhaps in the past, or at least more consciously, which is to say that as much as I'm often critical, perhaps too critical, of liberal approaches, for example, to the issues that we're facing, even criminal justice approaches to animal exploitation, I do think that there's a group here in Toronto, an organization, for example, called Animal Justice. And they're doing great work. So it's made up of lawyers. Yeah, and this Justin Marceau, who's very against carceral logics, and Laurie Gruen as well, have made very important critiques of this. But this group of lawyers is advocating, is introducing bills to Parliament here in Canada. For example, important ones like bans on putting cetaceans in captivity, for example. Now they're working on one for all wild animals, that captivity of all wild animals should be banned. They also seek prosecution of animal abusers, both within and outside industrial agriculture and other institutions of violence. Now, there are a lot of problems with that, right? Because then you individualize a systemic problem, et cetera, et cetera. But to answer your question, I actually think that this kind of seeming hodgepodge and kind of almost contradictory, this group of contradictory approaches, or mess of contradictory approaches to animal liberation as a whole is making a difference. So although I share Sanban Matsu's pessimism on one hand, if I'm really honest, deep down on a soul level, if you will, I don't believe in the soul, but anyway, for lack of a better word, on a felt level, it does not look good. It looks like, animal violence against animals is increasing, even as the number of vegans increases. However, I do think that a combination of something like this organization and various organizations like it, where you have younger generations becoming animal lawyers, for example, normalizing a discussion of normalizing and legitimizing concerns around violence against animals, both on an individual level and systemically. That plus, for example, critical animal studies programs with students starting to learn this material and think for themselves about these questions is very important and is making a small difference. So I teach critical animal studies at Brock University just this year. It's a one-year contract, so I'll be unemployed in September in case anybody has a job. But it's amazing to be speaking to this generation of students who now, they don't laugh, they don't scoff at the suggestion that abusing animals is unjust, or that an individual pig, has a right to fulfill her entelechy, or that a cow or a rat, has a meaningful relationship with her children, or to call their children, right? This is becoming normalized now within small circles. So I don't want to idealize it, but I have to say, because I was away for about 8 years or so doing other things, dancing, and when I came back, I saw that there was this shift in the level of acceptability of the kinds of discussions that critical animal studies scholars have been having now for a couple of decades, and that is very encouraging. So I don't have the answer. I do think we do have to be stronger and we have to be more strategic in our presentation and then in our interventions into things like Extinction Rebellion, right? So, and I've tried this on a personal level. Animal Rebellion is a group that developed along with or alongside Extinction Rebellion, because Extinction Rebellion refused to focus on domesticated animals and violence against animals as such, right? They're focused only on extinction, but not on infinite reproducibility and the extermination of the subject in that sense. So we need to be stronger, I think, and intervene more especially in the ecological movement that just ignores violence against animals. So I think we need to take a stronger stand. And it's not about us accepting environmental concerns or us accepting social justice concerns anymore. As I said earlier, I feel like the burden is now actually on other groups to do that, because we've been doing this. I mean, critical animal studies has been intersectional for a very long time, and beyond intersectional, right? We incorporate all sorts of frameworks, decolonial, feminist, etc., anti-racist. And so it's really, I think, up to us to push and pressure other social justice groups to do a better job at what they proclaim to be doing. I don't think that's going to, save the world per se, but rather than the other option is to sort of dig a hole and hide, and give up. So I do feel that it's important that we push even harder, frankly. But that's the best I can tell you. And also embrace a variety of tactics, open rescue, right? This kind of more liberal, legalist approach, street activism, artistic activism, or whatever you want to call it. All of these different forms, they need to be validated, and perhaps there needs to be more of a conversation. But I don't think that we should be choosing, for example, one approach over the other. I really believe, again, as I said at the beginning, in a kind of strategic pluralism to get the message, if you will, out there.
Thank you so much. I really like your idea of being more focused on the strategy. I think it will help with anything else as well. Thank you again.
Thank you. Actually, and I did want to add, this is something that others are doing, like Anita Crank, who is the founder of Toronto Pig Save, but has now moved more towards what the plant-based treaty. So again, this is within a liberal paradigm, but I don't think that that's per se a problem, although liberalism is also kind of often looked down upon as somehow inherently against the grain of social justice, but I don't think that that's necessarily true. But plant-based treaty. So these proactive measures, and Animal Rebellion was doing this as well when I was a part of them several years ago, trying to engage government bodies to actually shift to plant-based agriculture. So if we're talking specifically about extinction, as you mentioned, and climate change, obviously, and of course, the torture of animals systemically, agriculture is a huge one. And so we need to be really actively engaging with these institutions that are making these decisions. So again, that's where the more conventional approach, I think, is actually really useful. And the same goes for laboratory experimentation. We have a lot of very brilliant minds that, if only there were resources and commitment, could be developing amazing alternatives, and are already. Some have already been, many have been developed, but they're just not used as much or touted as much. So I think really directly being in conversation with institutions as well is extremely important. And of course, advocating for a shift to plant-based food systems, sustainable food systems, is a top priority.
Yes, thank you very much for the answer, Zipporah. I have to stop our discussion here. So, yes, thank you very much for participating in our conference. I think for researchers in Russia, it seems to me that your presentation, your speech was very important, given the recent rise in left-wing ideas. So, thank you very much. We are looking forward to further cooperation.
Thank you so much again for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure.